What's his name?
Yeah.
Nah. Been there, done that. Cut the cord.
There is a specific kind of television moment that stops being funny about halfway through and starts being something else entirely. You laugh at first, then you go quiet, then you spend the rest of the episode sitting with a vaguely uncomfortable feeling you can't quite name. The Bulgarian vow renewal episode of Darcey and Stacey is one of those moments. I've watched a lot of reality television, more than I would honestly like to admit, and I genuinely cannot think of another sequence that managed to be this chaotic, this revealing, and this sad, all within what felt like 45 minutes. Today, I want to talk about what actually happened in Bulgaria, not in the tabloid version where everything is reduced to Darcey threw up, lol, but in the version where you look at the whole picture and ask what this trip was actually supposed to accomplish and what it ended up revealing instead. Because I think the Bulgaria episode is one of the most instructive pieces of footage this franchise has ever produced, and not for the reasons most people discuss. My read on this whole situation, which I'll lay out across this video, is that Darcey went to Bulgaria with one specific goal: to manufacture proof that her marriage was real. She wanted his family's approval, a ceremony on his soil, photographs of the two of them in his country looking like a couple that made sense. She wanted the version of the relationship she had been describing to her own family and friends and the cameras. And instead, Bulgaria handed her the unedited version. The vomiting, the fight about the women on his phone, the separate taxis to the airport. None of that was incidental. All of it was already there. Bulgaria just turned the lights on. That's the argument I'm making. Let me walk through it. For viewers who need a refresher, or who came in without having watched all of Darcey and Stacey on TLC, here's the relevant context. Darcey Silva, from Connecticut, has been one of the franchise's most prominent figures for years. She first appeared on 90 Day Fiancé before the 90 Days, with Jesse Meester, a Dutch man she had a relationship with that became famous primarily for how spectacularly and publicly it fell apart. She then moved on to Tom Brooks, which went similarly. By the time she arrived on her own spin-off, Darcey and Stacey, she was in a relationship with Georgi Rusev, a Bulgarian man she had met and developed feelings for relatively quickly. Georgi is younger than Darcey. The show made clear early on that he had essentially no financial resources of his own when they got together, that Darcey was the one funding the relationship in practical terms, and that this dynamic created an underlying tension that neither of them ever really addressed head-on. Darcey and Georgi got legally married in the United States before the Bulgaria trip, which is its own interesting detail. The vow renewal in Bulgaria wasn't the official ceremony. It was a second ceremony, something Darcey organized and paid for, in his home country, with his family present, for reasons she described publicly in terms of wanting to include his family and honor his culture, which is a genuinely sweet impulse on its own. But watching the episode, it's hard not to notice that there's something else underneath it. When you're not totally secure in a relationship, or when you suspect on some level that the people around you have doubts, one of the things people do is create events. Milestone moments that feel like evidence. A wedding in his home country, surrounded by his family, with his culture incorporated into the ceremony, is a very powerful piece of evidence. It says, "Look how serious we are. Look how much he has committed. Look how well this works." And if his family smiles and toasts and tells her she's wonderful, that means something real, right? It means the doubts were wrong. I'm not diagnosing Darcey with anything. I'm just describing what seems visible in the footage and what I think motivated the trip at a basic human level. She needed the Bulgaria trip to go well, probably more than she needed most things in that relationship to go well, because the alternative was having to look directly at what the relationship actually was. The ceremony itself was, by all visible evidence, lovely. Darcey wore a stunning dress. There were flowers. His family was present. She put on a red veil at some point and said on camera that it made her feel pure and like a virgin, which honestly is the kind of thing that could only happen on this show, and I say that with some affection. There's a romanticism to Darcey that is genuinely endearing, even when it's completely disconnected from the situation she's actually in. She wants the fairy tale. She has always wanted the fairy tale. And for a few hours in Bulgaria, standing in a decorated venue with his family watching, she probably had something close to it. And then the night went sideways. The vomiting is what everyone talks about, and I get why, because it is genuinely remarkable television. During the reception, or shortly after, Darcey became violently ill. The show documented her being extremely sick, multiple times, over what seemed like an extended period. The evening that was supposed to end with them finally consummating the relationship, in the way that vow renewals are presumably supposed to end, did not end that way. She was too ill. He pulled away. The night collapsed. Darcey's explanation on camera was that there was bad energy in the room. She felt it during the ceremony, and she said that she believed the sickness was connected to that bad energy. This is the moment I want to spend some time on, because I think people dismiss it too quickly by just saying she was drunk or she was being dramatic, and I also think people take it too seriously on the other end by treating bad energy as a real diagnosis of something supernatural. My read is that neither of those framings is quite right. Darcey had just married a man under genuinely enormous stress. She had flown to a foreign country, organized an expensive ceremony, was performing her marriage for his family and the cameras simultaneously, had been carrying the financial weight of the relationship largely on her own, had real and documented anxiety about the relationship's stability, and was drinking local wine at an event that was freighted with more emotional significance than probably any other day in that relationship. That is an enormous amount of stress for anyone's nervous system to manage. Stress and anxiety can make people physically ill. That's not controversial. I'm not saying her body was sending her a mystical message. I'm saying the explanation that the stress of that specific situation contributed to her getting sick is more plausible to me than the idea that it was purely the wine. The bad energy framing is interesting because it's the language Darcey uses to process things she doesn't have other words for. She uses it consistently throughout her time on the show. When she says she felt bad energy in the room during the ceremony, I think she's describing something real, a feeling, a sense that something was off, a kind of low-grade alarm that she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The question is whether she connected that feeling to the right cause. Because from where I'm sitting, the bad energy wasn't in the room. It was in the relationship. The morning after is where the episode really turns. And this is the part that I think deserves more serious discussion than it usually gets. Darcey was recovering from being violently ill the night of her vow renewal. She was in his home country. She was exhausted and probably emotionally depleted. And according to what aired, she looked at Georgi's phone and found that he had been looking at photos of young Bulgarian women. The show presents this as a discovery, a caught-in-the-act moment, and Darcey's reaction is intense and immediate. I want to be careful here about what I say and what I don't say, because I only know what aired and what Darcey and Georgi have each said publicly. I don't know the full context of what was on his phone or what the surrounding circumstances were. But here's what I can say about the optics, which are pretty bad. Your wife just spent significant money to bring you a wedding ceremony in your home country. She spent the night of that ceremony being violently ill. She is the next morning recovering from that, in your country, surrounded by your family. And that is the morning you choose, apparently, to scroll through photos of younger women. I don't have to invent anything to say that the timing is genuinely rough. Darcey's reaction during the fight that followed was, predictably, not measured. She made statements about his finances, about how she has the money and he doesn't, about bank transfers and who has leverage in this relationship. This is a pattern with Darcey and Georgi that shows up multiple times across the series. When she feels hurt or insecure, she reaches for the financial dynamic as a weapon, presumably because it's the one area where she clearly holds the advantage. And every time she does it, it makes things worse, not better. It gives Georgi a grievance to focus on instead of the original issue, and it shifts the conversation from whatever he did to whatever she said. I'm not saying she was wrong to be angry. I'm saying the way she expressed it was probably counterproductive, and I think on some level she knows that, which is maybe why she does it. If the fight escalates badly enough, you don't have to actually resolve the thing that started it. The separate taxis are, to me, the most telling part of the whole episode, more than the vomiting, more than the fight. They had to get to the airport to fly back to the United States. They could not ride in the same vehicle. 2 taxis, paid for separately, after a vow renewal ceremony held 2 days earlier. There is something almost mathematical about that detail. You add up the ceremony and the illness and the fight and the pictures on his phone, and then you arrive at 2 taxis. And it's a very precise summary of where they actually were versus where the trip was supposed to put them. She organized this entire event to demonstrate that the marriage was solid, and the event ended with them being unable to share a car to the airport. I think about the logistics of that for a second. Someone had to make the decision to get separate cars. Someone had to call or book the second taxi. That's a real choice that happened in real time, not just a dramatic gesture for the cameras. They genuinely could not be in a small enclosed space together for the drive to the airport. And then she left Bulgaria alone, not with her husband, not with a sense that the trip had accomplished anything. Alone in a taxi, going to an airport, flying home from a trip she had organized and funded to prove that her marriage was fine. Now, here is where I want to spend some time with the counter-argument, because I think it's worth taking seriously. There is a version of this story where Georgi is being treated as entirely guilty by the edit and the framing, and where that's not entirely fair. Reality television editing is not neutral. Scenes are selected, arranged, scored, and presented in a specific sequence to tell a specific story. The show had a narrative interest in presenting this relationship as troubled because troubled relationships make for compelling television. I can't see the footage that didn't make it into the episode. I can't know what conversations they had off camera or what context existed around the moments that did air. There are people online who have argued that Georgi was never as bad as he looked on the show, that the financial dependence dynamic was more complicated than it appeared, and that Darcey's own behavior in the relationship was difficult in ways the show didn't always fully examine. I think some of that is probably true. Darcey has moments on camera where she is genuinely hard to be around. She can escalate quickly, she can repeat herself in arguments, she can make the same move of reaching for financial leverage when she feels cornered. A relationship is two people, and I'm not going to pretend that Georgi was simply a villain and Darcey was simply a victim. It's not that clean. I also genuinely don't know what was on his phone. The show presented it as photos of young Bulgarian women, and Darcey's reaction was visceral, but I wasn't there. It's possible there was context I'm missing. It's possible the moment was more ambiguous than it appeared on screen. I'm working from what aired, and what aired told a particular story that I have to take with at least some acknowledgement that I'm not getting the full picture. What I do feel more confident about is the structural situation they were in, regardless of individual moments. A large age gap, a significant financial imbalance, a pattern of her funding experiences and him receiving them, and underneath all of that, genuine insecurity about whether the relationship was what she believed it was. Those things were documented consistently enough across enough episodes that I feel comfortable saying they were real features of the relationship, not just editorial choices. And the Bulgaria trip lands differently once you accept that those structural problems were real. Because the trip didn't create them. The trip just put them somewhere they couldn't be managed. Here's where I land on all of this. Darcey went to Bulgaria to fix something that couldn't be fixed by a ceremony. She wanted an event powerful enough to make the relationship feel secure, and she spent real money and real emotional energy building it, and when it collapsed, it didn't just fail as a trip. It failed as a proof of concept. The thing she was trying to demonstrate turned out not to be demonstrable. I don't think her body rejected Georgi in any mystical sense, but I do think the illness happened at the worst possible moment for the worst possible reasons, which is to say that she was a person under enormous stress trying to maintain a performance of security she didn't actually feel, and her body was not cooperating with the performance. Whether that's meaningful or not is genuinely above my pay grade. What I think is meaningful is the pattern. This was not the first time Darcey tried to solve a relational problem with an event. She had done versions of this before, trying to create a moment big enough to validate what she wanted the relationship to be. And it consistently doesn't work, not because she's foolish, but because events can't substitute for the underlying thing. You can have the most beautiful ceremony in the world and still end up in separate taxis to the airport 2 days later. The part that genuinely sticks with me, and I'm being honest here, is the image of her in that second taxi. She had organized the whole trip. She had paid for it. She had brought the cameras and the dress and the flowers and the red veil. She had done everything she could think of to make it real. And she ended up leaving the country by herself. That's not funny. I know this show presents itself in a way that invites you to laugh, and I've laughed at it too, plenty. But that specific image is just sad. A person leaving a country she traveled to in order to feel loved, alone, in a car she had to book separately because she couldn't share one with her husband. Whatever happened between Darcey and Georgi after Bulgaria, and the show continued for more seasons, the Bulgaria episode to me is the clearest possible illustration of the problem at the center of their relationship. She was trying to make him into something the evidence suggested he wasn't. He was accepting what she offered without meeting her in the middle. And neither of them, at least not in what aired, seemed to be able to have a direct conversation about what was actually going on. That's not a Bulgarian problem. That's the problem. Bulgaria just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. The whole franchise runs on this dynamic in one form or another. People who want something badly enough to fly across the world for it, and then find that wanting it badly isn't enough. Darcey's version is maybe the most extreme version of it, because she wanted it loudly and publicly and across multiple seasons, and because she kept betting on events to save her, when what she probably needed was to stop and look directly at what was in front of her. I don't say that with judgment. It's genuinely hard to look directly at something when you've already invested this much in it being a certain way. Most of us have been in some version of that. The stakes are usually lower. We don't usually fly to Bulgaria to prove the point, but the human impulse underneath it is recognizable. What she was looking for in Bulgaria, she'd been looking for throughout the whole relationship. And maybe that's the real story. Not the vomiting, not the fight, not the separate taxis, even though all of those things are legitimately remarkable. The real story is that she got on that plane looking for proof, and she came home without it. And then, as the show documented, she kept going. Because that's what people do.